My mom sued me after my dad got cancer. They hated me growing up, and when I ran away, my dad wanted to make amends, but my mom tried to take everything from me. Hey Reddit, I never thought I'd be writing something like this, but I guess I need to get this off my chest. I've been carrying this weight for so long that it feels suffocating at times. My life has been a constant struggle with my parents, and frankly, myself. This isn't just a vent. It's a story about how I finally decided to break free and search for something better, something that feels like my own. I'll warn you, it's long and messy, but here it goes. Growing up, I was never the kid that parents doted on or adored. My parents, especially my father, made it very clear from a young age that I was a disappointment. I wasn't the athletic, charming, or charismatic kid they wanted. I was quiet, introverted, and more interested in books than the footballs my dad tried to shove into my hands. It's not that I didn't try to make them happy. God, I tried. But nothing was ever enough. My mom was just as bad, if not worse. It's like they were both competing to see who could make me feel smaller. Every report card, every little mistake I made, was scrutinized. My father would berate me endlessly, telling me I'd never amount to anything. My mom was more subtle about it. She'd tell me she was just disappointed, which somehow stung more than my dad's yelling. School was my only escape, though even that was tainted by my parents' constant disapproval. If I got Anna, my dad would ask why it wasn't Anna. If I scored well in a test, my mom would remind me that it didn't really matter because someone else's kid was probably doing better. It was relentless. My childhood was a cycle of trying and failing to impress them, and no matter what I did, I was never good enough. By the time I reached high school, I was a ghost in my own home. I would lock myself in my room for hours, drowning out their voices with music or the sounds of video games. I wasn't rebellious, no, I never had the guts for that. I was just invisible. They never cared what I was doing, unless it was something they could criticize. I didn't really have any friends in high school either. I wasn't bullied or anything like that, I just didn't fit in. I was the weird kid who kept his head down, avoided eye contact, and never spoke unless spoken to. My parents blamed me for that too. They'd say things like, "No wonder you don't have any friends, you're so awkward," or "You need to put yourself out there more." I wanted to scream at them, tell them that maybe if they didn't treat me like I was worthless, I might have some confidence, but I never did. Instead, I buried myself in my studies. School was my escape, the one place where I could control things. Numbers made sense. Equations had answers. Essays had a structure. It was predictable, and predictability was something I craved. While I wasn't the top of my class, I did well enough, and after years of feeling trapped, I finally saw a way out: college. College was my salvation. It was my chance to get away from my parents, to leave behind the constant disappointment and suffocation. I worked harder than I ever had in my life to get into a decent university, and when I got accepted, I didn't even tell my parents. I waited until the last possible minute because I knew they wouldn't care. Sure enough, when I finally told them, my father's only response was, "Well, I hope you don't screw it up. Thanks for the vote of confidence, Dad." When I left for college, it was like a massive weight had been lifted off my shoulders. I moved several hours away from home and felt like I could finally breathe. For the first time in my life, I was living for myself, not for the expectations or judgments of others. College wasn't easy, but it was a world away from the misery I left behind. At first, I struggled to adjust. I was still the same introverted, awkward guy I'd always been, but at least no one here knew me as the loser my parents had raised. No one knew how broken I was on the inside. I could start fresh, and I was determined to make the most of it. I threw myself in my studies again, just like I had in high school, but this time it was different. I wasn't studying to escape. I was studying to build something for myself. During my second year, I met a group of people who would change my life. I never imagined myself having close friends, let alone a group that felt like family, but somehow it happened. There was Jack, a guy who seemed like the polar opposite of me, confident, outgoing, and never afraid to speak his mind. Then there was Maya, a quiet, artistic soul who understood the feeling of not quite fitting in. And lastly, there was Andrew, a laid-back guy who had a knack for making everyone feel comfortable. We met in one of our shared classes and hit it off, though it took me a while to really open up to them. Jack, Maya, and Andrew were the first people who saw something in me, something other than failure or awkwardness. For the first time, I had people who cared about me, who didn't see me as a disappointment. Slowly, I began to trust them, to let them in on the truth about my past, my family, and the years of feeling worthless. Jack was shocked when he heard about my parents. He said something that stuck with me. "Man, you don't owe them anything. They don't deserve you." I'd never thought about it like that before. I always felt like I owed my parents something, that I was somehow obligated to win their approval. But hearing someone else say I didn't have to, it was liberating. The years flew by, and before I knew it, I was graduating. My friends and I had made it through together, and I should have been ecstatic, but there was this gnawing feeling in the back of my mind. I knew what was waiting for me back home. After the ceremony, I got a text from my dad. "Don't bother coming back. You've already embarrassed us enough." I don't even know why I was surprised. I had always known that they didn't care about me. Still, it hurt. It was a reminder that no matter how much I achieved, it would never be enough for them. That night, I made a decision. I wasn't going back. Ever. I packed up everything I owned and, without telling anyone, hopped on a bus to another city. I left behind the town I had grown up in, the house filled with memories of their disappointment and my so-called family. I had no plan, no job lined up, no real sense of what the future held. But for the first time in my life, I felt free. Free from their criticism, their control, and the weight of their expectations. I didn't tell Jack, Maya, or Andrew that I was leaving until I had already arrived in the new city. I knew they would have tried to talk me out of it, to tell me I should confront my parents or try to make things right. But there was nothing left to salvage. My relationship with my parents was broken beyond repair, and I had no intention of picking up the pieces. They didn't want me, and I didn't want them. Starting over wasn't easy. I found a cheap apartment in a sketchy part of the city and lived off my savings for a while. I applied for jobs, but nothing seemed to stick. Every rejection felt like a confirmation of everything my parents had ever told me, that I wasn't good enough, that I would never make it on my own. But then I remembered what Jack had said, "You don't owe them anything." Slowly, I started to rebuild. I found a job at a small tech startup, nothing glamorous, but it paid the bills. I threw myself into the work, just like I had done with my studies. It became my new escape. Every day was a chance to prove to myself that I could make it on my own, without my parents, without their approval. It was tough, and there were days when I wanted to give up, but I kept pushing forward. The hardest part was being alone. I had left my friends behind, and while I stayed in touch with them, it wasn't the same. They didn't understand why I had to leave, why I couldn't stay and confront my parents. But I knew they couldn't truly understand what it was like to grow up in a home where you were constantly reminded of your worthlessness. It took months, but eventually, I found my footing. I started making new friends at work, people who didn't know anything about my past. It was refreshing, being around people who saw me for who I was now, not who I had been. I started to feel like I belonged somewhere, like maybe I wasn't as broken as I thought. But just when I thought I had escaped my past, life threw me another curveball. One day, out of the blue, I got a call from my mom. I hadn't heard from her or my dad since the day of my graduation, and I had no intention of reaching out to them. But there she was, her voice shaking as she told me that my dad had been in an accident. He was in the hospital, and she didn't know if he would make it. For a moment, I felt nothing. The man who had spent my entire life tearing me down was lying in a hospital bed, and I didn't care. But then, the guilt crept in. He was still my father, no matter how much I hated him. And a part of me wondered if I should go back. Should I forgive him? Should I be there for him in his final moments? I didn't know what to do. I spent the rest of the day in a daze, replaying every horrible thing he had ever said to me. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that maybe, just maybe, this was my chance to make things right, or at least get some closure. But then the shock came. The next morning, I got another call, not from my mom, but from a lawyer. Apparently, my father had passed away during the night. He had left behind a will, and I was named in it. I didn't want anything from him. I didn't want his money, his possessions, or anything that reminded me of the life I had left behind. But curiosity got the better of me, and I agreed to meet with the lawyer. That meeting was one of the most surreal experiences of my life. The lawyer handed me a letter written by my father before he died. In it, he confessed that he had never believed in me, that he had always thought I was destined to fail. But as he lay on his deathbed, he realized how wrong he had been. He told me he was proud of me, that he regretted the way he had treated me, and that he hoped I could forgive him. I didn't know what to think. This man, who had spent his entire life making me feel like I was worthless, was suddenly asking for forgiveness. It felt like too little, too late. But at the same time, it gave me a sense of closure I didn't know I needed. I left the lawyer's office with a heavy heart, unsure of what to do next. I didn't feel like I had truly escaped my past, but for the first time, I felt like I could move on. My father's death had closed a chapter of my life that I had been trying to run away from for so long. And while I still had a lot of healing to do, I knew that I was finally on the right path. Hey Reddit, I'm back with part 2 of my crazy journey. If you've read my last post, you know I had a pretty rough upbringing, and after graduating college I cut ties with my parents and moved to a new city. Starting over wasn't easy, but I eventually found a job at a tech startup. I thought things were looking up for me until life, once again, decided to throw me a curveball. Let's dive right in. After the whirlwind of leaving my old life behind and settling into a new city, I managed to land a job at a mid-sized tech company called Nexigen. They were doing some innovative stuff with data analytics and cloud solutions, and while I wasn't passionate about tech, I figured it was a stable place to start. I joined as a junior marketing associate, a pretty low-level position, but at least it paid the bills. For the first few months, things were going fine. I was learning the ropes, getting to know the ins and outs of the company, and keeping my head down. I wasn't the most outgoing guy, but I made a couple of friends in the office, Chris from accounting and Lily from HR. We would grab coffee on lunch breaks and bond over our shared frustrations with the monotony of office life. Then, one day, everything changed. I remember it vividly. It was a Tuesday morning, and I was sitting at my desk, working on a social media campaign for one of our smaller clients, when I got called into my manager's office. I didn't think much of it at first. I figured it was just a routine check-in, but when I walked in, the vibe was off. My manager, Greg, was sitting behind his desk with a stern expression, and next to him was the HR manager, Lily, the same one I'd been grabbing coffee with. "Have a seat," Greg said, his tone cold and formal. I sat down, feeling a pit forming in my stomach. Something was wrong. "Look, I'm going to cut to the chase," Greg began. "We've been reviewing your performance, and it's just not meeting the company's expectations. We're going to have to let you go." I was stunned. Sure, I wasn't the best marketer in the world, but I hadn't been slacking off either. I thought I was doing fine, decent, even, but here they were, telling me I was out. "What do you mean? Can you be more specific?" I stammered, trying to keep my composure. Greg sighed, glancing at Lily, who just gave me a sympathetic look. "Your campaigns haven't been driving the results we were hoping for. We need people who can hit the ground running, and unfortunately, we don't think you're a fit for that." I sat there speechless. I'd been fired before I even had a chance to really prove myself. It felt like a punch to the gut. Lily handed me an envelope. "This is your severance package," she said softly. "You'll be paid for the next 2 weeks, and we're offering career counseling services if you need them." I couldn't even process what was happening. It was like the ground had been ripped out from under me. I grabbed the envelope, muttered a thanks, and walked out of the office in a daze. I packed up my things in silence, feeling the weight of disappointment and failure settling on my shoulders. Chris came over, looking shocked. "Dude, what the hell happened?" he whispered. "I got fired," I said flatly. He looked at me like I just told him I'd been hit by a car. "That's bullshit, man. You didn't deserve this." Maybe I didn't, but it didn't matter. I was out. I gave Chris a half-hearted smile, grabbed my stuff, then left the office without looking back. For the next few weeks, I spiraled into a pretty dark place. I'd thought leaving my parents behind would be the hardest thing I'd ever do. But this felt like a whole new level of failure. I had no job, no direction, and the little savings I had were quickly dwindling. I spent my days sending out resumes and cover letters, but the job market was brutal. It seemed like no one was hiring, and the few interviews I did get went nowhere. I felt like I was back to square one, stuck in the same cycle of not being good enough. But then, out of nowhere, something unexpected happened. One evening, as I was mindlessly scrolling through job postings, my phone buzzed. It was a text from a number I didn't recognize. I almost ignored it, but something made me open it. "Hey, this is Daniel Lawrence. I heard you're looking for work. Let's meet." Daniel Lawrence. The name sounded vaguely familiar, but I couldn't place it. I quickly Googled him and nearly dropped my phone when I saw who he was. The CEO of Nexus Solutions, one of the fastest growing tech companies in the country. I had no idea how he'd gotten my number, but I wasn't about to question it. This was the opportunity I'd been waiting for. I replied, agreeing to meet the next day at a coffee shop downtown. When I walked in, I spotted him immediately. A tall, charismatic-looking man in his late 40s with sharp features and a commanding presence. He waved me over to his table. "Thanks for meeting with me," I said nervously, sitting down across from him. "Of course," he replied with a smile. "I've heard some good things about you." I had no idea who would have said anything good about me, but I wasn't about to argue. We chatted for a while, and I told him about my experience at Nexogen and how I'd been let go. To my surprise, he seemed genuinely interested. "You've got potential," he said after I finished my story. "I can tell. And I think you just haven't had the right opportunities yet." He was right, but it was still hard to believe someone like him saw anything in me. Then came the offer. "I'm not looking to hire anyone right now, but I could use some help with a side project," he said. "It's nothing glamorous, but it could lead to something bigger if you're interested." I didn't hesitate. I agreed to help him, even though I had no idea what I was getting into. Over the next few months, I worked closely with Daniel on various small projects, mostly marketing-related stuff for Nexus Solutions. It was nothing groundbreaking, but it kept me busy and gave me a reason to get out of bed in the morning. Daniel and I grew closer during that time. He wasn't the intimidating CEO I'd expected him to be. He was down to earth, funny, and most importantly, he believed in me. He pushed me to think outside the box, to take risks, and to stop doubting myself. Then, about 6 months into working with him, Daniel fell ill. It started as a minor cold, but it quickly spiraled into something much worse. He was diagnosed with a serious autoimmune disorder, and his health took a sharp decline. I didn't know what to do. Here was the one person who had given me a shot when no one else would, and now he was bedridden, fighting for his life. One night I got a call from him. "Hey, I need you to do something for me," he said, his voice weak but determined. "I trust you." My heart was pounding. "Anything, man." "What do you need?" "I'm going to be out of commission for a while," he said. "I need you to keep things running at Nexus. I've already spoken to the board. They'll support you, but I need you to lead the charge." I was floored. Me? Run a multi-million-dollar tech company? I could barely keep my life together, let alone a business. But Daniel wouldn't hear any excuses. "You're capable of more than you think," he said. "I've seen what you can do. This is your chance to prove it." The next few months were a whirlwind. I was thrust into a leadership role at Nexus, and I had no idea what I was doing. But somehow, I managed to keep things afloat. I worked around the clock, juggling marketing campaigns, investor meetings, and internal company politics. There were moments when I thought I was going to fail, but every time I felt like giving up, I heard Daniel's voice in my head, telling me I could do this. And then came the breakthrough. Nexus had been struggling to increase its market share, and our competitors were closing in. I knew we needed something bold, something that would set us apart. I spent weeks brainstorming ideas, running through scenarios, and crunching numbers, until finally, I came up with a marketing ploy that I believed could turn things around. It was risky. It involved cutting prices on our flagship product by 20% for a limited time to drive up demand, with the goal of gaining a larger customer base that would generate long-term revenue. The board was skeptical, but I pushed hard for it, convinced that it was the right move. We launched the campaign, and within weeks, the company's revenue shot up by 8%. I couldn't believe it. My risky gamble had paid off, and Nexus was back in the game. Daniel called me from his hospital bed to congratulate me. He sounded weak, but there was pride in his voice. "You did it," he said. "I knew you could." The success of the campaign didn't just save the company, it cemented my place at Nexus. When Daniel eventually returned to work, he made me an offer that would change my life forever. "You've proven yourself," he said. "I want you to stay on as the chief marketing officer, but there's more. I'm offering you a percentage of the company's revenue as a bonus. We're partners now." I was speechless. A partnership? A cut of the revenue? This was beyond anything I had ever dreamed of. I accepted without hesitation. Over the next 3 years, Nexus Solutions thrived. Under my leadership in marketing, we introduced several more campaigns that boosted our revenue by an additional 21%. The company expanded into new markets, acquired smaller competitors, and became a dominant force in the industry. Daniel, who had recovered but decided to take a step back from the day-to-day operations, trusted me completely with the company's future. There were some shocking moments along the way. Like the time one of our biggest competitors tried to poach me with a ludicrous offer of stock options and a cushy position. But I turned them down. Nexus was my home now. I had built something here, and I wasn't about to abandon it. Another surprise came when Daniel revealed that he had written me into his will. I wasn't just his business partner, I was his friend. He told me that if anything ever happened to him, I would inherit his shares in the company. It was an overwhelming gesture, one that left me speechless. I never thought I'd be in a position where someone would trust me with something so significant. But perhaps the most shocking moment of all came when my parents, who had all but disowned me years ago, suddenly reappeared in my life. I got a call from my mom, out of the blue, telling me how proud she was of everything I had accomplished. It felt surreal, like I was talking to a stranger. They wanted to reconnect, to make amends for the years of neglect and mistreatment. But I wasn't the same person I had been back then. I wasn't the scared, insecure kid who needed their approval. I had built something for myself, something they had never believed I was capable of. So, I politely declined their offer. It wasn't out of spite or anger. I had just moved on. I had found a new family in Daniel and the people at Nexus, and that was enough for me. Now, 3 years after taking on the role of Commander-in-Chief at Nexus, I look back on everything that's happened and can hardly believe it. From being fired to leading a multi-million-dollar company, it's been a wild ride. There have been plenty of ups and downs, but through it all, I've learned one thing. You can't let your past define you. I don't know what the future holds for Nexus or for me, but I do know this. I'm not the same person I was when I first moved to this city. I'm stronger, more confident, and for the first time in my life, I feel like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. Hey Reddit, it's been a while since I posted, and a lot has happened since then. If you've been following my story, you know that I managed to climb from rock bottom after being fired to becoming a partner, and eventually Commander-in-Chief, at a multi-million-dollar tech company called Nexus Solutions. But just when I thought I had finally escaped my past, life decided to pull me back in, and it all started when my mother showed up at my doorstep. This part of my story is a lot darker than what's come before. Honestly, I'm still processing everything, but writing has always helped me, so here it goes. It was a quiet Saturday morning. I had just settled into my routine, coffee, a bit of work, maybe a jog later when there was a knock on my door. At first I thought it was a delivery, but when I opened it, there she was. My mother. The woman I hadn't seen in years, standing on my doorstep with that same cold expression I remembered from my childhood. "Mom," I said, my voice barely a whisper. I hadn't expected to ever see her again, let alone at my own home. She looked older than I remembered, more tired. Her once well-kept appearance replaced by deep lines of bitterness etched into her face. Her eyes were bloodshot, and even from where I stood, I could smell the alcohol on her breath. It was only 10. I need to talk to you, she said, pushing past me and stepping into my house without waiting for an invitation. I stood frozen for a moment, completely thrown off guard. My mind raced. Why was she here? What did she want? The last time we'd spoken was when my father died, and even then it was just a brief, emotionless conversation. Now, here she was, acting as though she had every right to walk into my life, like nothing had happened. I closed the door and followed her into the living room, where she had already plopped herself down on the couch, her purse clutched tightly in her lap like a lifeline. I could feel the tension in the air. Look, Mom, if this is about Dad, I started, but she cut me off before I could finish. Of course this is about your father, she snapped. Her voice slurred slightly from whatever she had been drinking that morning. You think I came here for a friendly chat? You've got some nerve, thinking you can just walk away from your family and live this fancy life, while I've been left with nothing. I blinked, stunned by the venom in her words. What are you talking about? I didn't walk away from anything. You and Dad never wanted me. I'm just trying to build a life for myself, she scoffed, her lips curling into a sneer. You're trying to build a life, huh? By stealing everything that should have been ours. I had no idea what she was talking about. I hadn't stolen anything. Every bit of success I did came from hard work and perseverance. But before I could respond, she launched into a tirade. You think you can just run off and take everything for yourself? Your father died because of you. Her voice rose, becoming shrill. If you hadn't left, if you hadn't abandoned us, maybe he'd still be alive. But no, you had to run off and play big-shot businessman. I felt like I had been punched in the gut. She was blaming me for his death. The man who had spent my entire life belittling and tearing me down. The man who had never once shown me any love or support. It was absurd. But in that moment, all the old feelings of guilt and inadequacy came rushing back. It was like I was a kid again, being scolded for not living up to their impossible expectations. I didn't abandon anyone, I said, my voice shaky but firm. I left because I had to. You and Dad never cared about me, and you know it. She ignored my words, her eyes narrowing as she leaned forward. You've got a nice life here, don't you? Big house, fancy job, probably more money than you know what to do with. Well, I want my share. Your father built you into the man you are, and I deserve something for all those years we put into raising you. I stared at her, completely floored by her audacity. You want a share? I repeated, not sure if I had heard her right. That's right, she said, her voice hardening. I know about the company. I know how much money you're making. I've got nothing, and it's your fault. So, you're going to give me what I'm owed. This was beyond anything I could have anticipated. She had always been cruel, but this, demanding a piece of the company I had worked so hard to help build, it was absurd. Mom, I don't owe you anything, I said, my voice firmer now. You and Dad made my life hell. I built this on my own. You didn't help me, you tried to hold me back. Her face twisted into an ugly scowl. You selfish little bastard, she hissed. You think you can just brush me off like that? Well, I've got news for you. I'm going to take you to court. I'll sue you for what's rightfully mine. At that moment, I felt a chill run down my spine. My own mother was threatening to sue me. I had no idea what legal ground she thought she had, but the threat alone sent a wave of anxiety through me. Good luck with that, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. You won't win. We'll see about that, she spat, standing up and glaring at me. I've already spoken to a lawyer. I'm going to make sure you pay for abandoning us. And with that, she stormed out of my house, slamming the door behind her. The next few weeks were a blur of stress and uncertainty. True to her word, my mother filed a lawsuit against me, claiming that she was entitled to a portion of my earnings and a stake in Nexus Solutions. Her claim was absurd. There was no legal basis for it, but the fact that she had actually gone through with it rattled me. I had never been sued before, let alone by my own mother. Her lawyer, a man named Anthony Wilkins, was a bottom-of-the-barrel attorney. I looked into him after the lawsuit was filed and found out he had a reputation for taking on desperate clients who couldn't afford real legal representation, My mother's alcoholism made her an easy target for someone like him. He probably saw her as a quick payday. But, even so, the thought of going to court against her weighed heavily on me. Daniel, my business partner and friend, was surprisingly calm when I told him what was going on. "She's got no case," he said. "She's just trying to shake you down. Don't let her gift to you." But it was easier said than done. As the dragged on, the stress of the impending lawsuit gnawed at me. My mother had always known how to get under my skin, and this was no different. Every day, I felt like I was fighting to keep my life from unraveling. Then, one day, something strange happened. I got a call from a man named Kevin O'Donnell. He was a private investigator I had hired to dig into my mother's lawyer, just to make sure there were no surprises waiting for me in court. What Kevin found changed everything. "Anthony Wilkins is cheap, but he's also dirty," Kevin said over the phone. "He's been involved in a couple of shady deals over the years, accepting bribes, fabricating evidence. The guy's got a price." I felt a flicker of hope. "You think he can be bought?" I asked, the wheels in my head already turning. "Absolutely," Kevin said. "If you make the right offer, he'll fold like a cheap suit." I knew it was risky, but I was desperate. My mother had dragged me into this nightmare, and I wasn't going to let her win. So I told Kevin to arrange a meeting with Wilkins. The meeting took place in a dingy bar on the outskirts of the city. I felt like I was walking into a scene from a bad crime drama, but this was my reality now. When I arrived, Wilkins was already sitting at a booth in the back, nursing a glass of whiskey. He looked even more disheveled in person than I had expected. His suit was wrinkled, his tie loose, and his eyes bloodshot from what I assumed was a combination of booze and sleepless nights. I slid into the booth across from him, and we exchanged a tense greeting. "You know why I'm here," I said, cutting straight to the point. He gave me a crooked smile. "I do," he said, taking a sip of his drink. "Your mother's got a lot of anger in her, thinks she's entitled to everything you've got." "Well, she's wrong," I said, "and I think you know that." Wilkins shrugged, leaning back in his seat. "Maybe, but that's not really my problem, is it? My job is to represent her." "I know what your job is," I said, my voice low, "but I also know you've got a price." He raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. "Go on." I laid it out for him. "You drop the case, walk away, and you get $50,000 and cash. No questions asked." Wilkins hesitated for a moment, his eyes narrowing as he considered the offer. $50,000 and huh? "That's right," I said, my heart pounding in my chest. "It's more than you'll ever get from my mother." He let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. "You've got a lot of balls, kid, but I'll tell you what, I'll take it. You'll have the case dismissed by the end of the week." I didn't trust myself to speak. I just nodded and stood up, sliding an envelope with half the money across the table. "You'll get the rest when the case is dropped." Wilkins grinned, pocketing the envelope. "Pleasure doing business with you." I walked out of that bar feeling like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. It wasn't exactly the most ethical move I'd ever made, but I wasn't going to let my mother ruin everything I had built. A week later, just as promised, the case was dismissed. My mother's lawyer had withdrawn, citing irreconcilable differences with his client. My mother was furious, of course. She called me, screaming and cursing, demanding to know what I had done, but I didn't give her the satisfaction of a response. I blocked her number and went back to focusing on my life. But even though I had won the legal battle, the emotional toll lingered. My own mother had tried to destroy me. She had blamed me for my father's death, tried to extort me, and dragged me into a legal nightmare. The whole experience left me feeling drained, bitter, and disillusioned. I had thought I could leave my past behind, but it seemed determined to haunt me no matter how far I ran. In the months that followed, I threw myself into my work at Nexus. The company was thriving, and under my leadership, we launched several new projects that took our revenue to new heights. We expanded into international markets, acquired a couple of smaller startups, and became a dominant player in the tech industry. On the surface, everything was perfect. But inside, I was still dealing with the fallout of my mother's betrayal. Daniel noticed the change in me. We had always been close, but after the lawsuit, I became more withdrawn, more guarded. He tried to talk to me about it, but I wasn't ready to open up. The truth was, I didn't know how to process what had happened. How do you move on when the person who's supposed to love you unconditionally turns on you like that? Eventually, I sought out therapy. It wasn't easy. I had always been the type to bottle things up, to push through pain without acknowledging it. But my therapist helped me see that I had been carrying the weight of my parents' rejection for far too long. The lawsuit was just the culmination of years of unresolved trauma. Through therapy, I began to heal. I learned to let go of the guilt, the anger, and the need for validation from people who had never truly cared about me. It was a slow process, but I started to feel lighter, freer. As for my mother, I haven't heard from her since the lawsuit. I assume she's still drinking herself into oblivion, but I no longer feel responsible for her choices. I've made peace with the fact that I can't change the past or the people in it. All I can do is move forward. So, here I am, Reddit, 3 years after my mother's lawsuit, and I'm still standing. Stronger than before, even. Nexus Solutions is thriving, and I've built a life for myself that I'm proud of, one that I created on my own terms. Life is full of unexpected twists and turns, but if there's one thing I've learned, it's that you can't let the past control you. People will try to drag you down, even those who were supposed to lift you up, but at the end of the day, the only person you can rely on is yourself. Thanks for listening, Reddit. It feels good to get this off my chest.